Welcome back to the Working with Raster Data in ArcPy module. In this section, we are going to talk about the primary environment settings in ArcGIS that impact our raster data analysis. Environment settings are simply those things that you can manually set that impact how your tools run and some of the settings for your output data sets. You've already experienced some of the environmental settings in ArcPy. Workspace is a great example. When you set it, the rest of the script must adhere to what you set, unless at some point in time you tell it not to. You turn it off or you set it to another location. The point here is that you are managing the environment within which the script runs and within which the tools run. Now, there are many environment settings in ArcGIS. We are not going to cover all of them. In desktop, you set them manually through the geoprocessing environment window, and in ArcPy, you set the proper code. You use the proper code by referencing the help documentation to know which settings are adhered to for each particular tool. Just to prove to you that you've likely seen these environment settings before in ArcGIS, here is what the environment settings look like and where they are found in ArcPro. They're found under the Analysis tab, Geoprocessing subgroup, and the Environments. When you open that up, you get a very long list of things that you can set that affect all things within ArcPro. Some of them affect your vector data, some of them affect your ArcPro project, but there are specific ones in here also for raster data, and I've opened up that particular setting. The most common ones that we use when it comes to raster analyses within a desktop environment are setting our workspace, setting our analysis extent, our cell size, our analysis mask, our cell alignment, and our snap raster. Like I mentioned, there are many environment settings, and we simply don't have time to cover them all. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on those that are used most often for raster analysis projects, those ones I just mentioned in the slide before. Just like where they're found for workspace, all of these properties are part of the ArcPy ENV class, the environment class. So we've worked with the workspace already. So what we're going to do here in the next slides is focus on processing extent, cell size, mask, and snap raster, which are the most common settings that are used in any type of raster data analysis. First, we're going to start with looking at the processing extent property, also referred to as analysis extent when you get into some of the professional documentation. This is simply the XY bounding box, also referred to as the envelope, that determines what cells are going to get processed within your geoprocessing tools, your raster analysis tools. The extent drives the spatial extent of any outputs from any raster tool that has this property set. So in the graphic here, you can see what we've done with this particular thing is we've set up this little box here to be the processing extent, which means if we were to put this data set into a raster tool that has this bounding box set up as the processing extent, only the cells that fall within this bounding box would be processed by the raster tool. The rest of them would be ignored. This would be the spatial extent of our output. It is a way to define a study area and define a limited amount of area that gets processed, because most of our raster tools are pretty heavy in the processing. So if you don't need to process the entire data set, the processing extent is a way to limit the number of cells that have to be put into a tool. Here is the help syntax for extent, processing extent. It is arcpy.env.extent. Notice that most often you're going to use a data set to set the extent, but you can set it in multiple ways. You can have all the min of, max of, you can define a bounding box with XY coordinates, or you can define what's called a path name, which is the path and the name to a data set that represents the extent. Notice that the default here is listed as being the max of is going to be the default. So whatever data sets you put in, whatever has the maximum extent would be the default. The most often thing done by GIS professionals is that you manually set this extent to match a data set that you know represents the area for which you want to be doing your analysis. So in this example, I've set it equal to be a grid that's called LULC grid, meaning that all of the cells that are in that data set that have data, those will be the only cells that are processed, and that will be the extent of any of our outputs. The next common environment setting with raster data that we're going to talk about is cell size. This is what drives the cell size of the outputs from any raster analysis tool. Most often, this is set to a number or a data set that represents the cell size that you'll want your outputs to be in. Notice that the default for this, again, is max of. So if you have multiple raster data sets going into an analysis that are of different cell sizes, if you do not set this environment setting, it will default to the default setting, which is max of, meaning that your output will be set to a cell size of the maximum, the largest cell size of any of your inputs. For that reason, more often than not, we manually set our cell size to be a number that we know for our analysis, or we set it to be equal to a data set that has a cell size that we know we want our outputs to be in the same cell size as this particular input data set. The mask setting is an environment setting that allows us to limit not just the spatial extent, but the individual cells within that extent that get processed in a raster tool. This is a similar concept to clip with vector data. It allows us to have a shape that's other than a square or a rectangle for the shape of the total cells that have value in them. So any cells that fall outside of the mask data set, it could be a polygon vector data set, or it could be a raster data set that has cells of data and no data. Only those that fall within the mask are going to be processed and included in the output. So in our little example here, you can see that we have a mask data set that's a raster data set. These purple cells represent cells that have data. The blank cells represent cells that have no data. If we process the input data set with the mask set as an environment setting, our output will be that same mask shape. Now, nowadays, this mask can either be a grid data set or a vector data set that represents the shape of what you want to be processing. The property of masking, here's what you can see from the help documentation. You can see its syntax, and you can see that it only has one way to set it. You must set it to be a data set. So the mask has to be a data set. It can either be a vector data set or a raster data set. I will say that the caveat to this is that you need to make sure that all of the data that you're working with in a raster analysis and setting as environment settings all is stored within the same coordinate system. Everything needs to be able to be seen in the same coordinate system in order for these settings to properly work and not produce any errors both in the desktop environment and also in the ArcPy environment. The final property we're going to cover is the snap raster. This is the setting that determines the starting point, which is actually the lower left-hand corner, for your output grids to begin drawing the grid that it's going to create for the output. So it's that lower left-hand corner that's the anchor for where that is going to be drawn. So you can see here, our example here is that these are two grids examples that have the same cell size and cover the same general area, but you can see they're slightly offset. This is where they have what we call poor cell alignment. They're off alignment. They don't have that same grid cell generation point, meaning where is it going to start to draw our boxes? By setting a snap raster, we're ensuring that our output is anchored in a particular location to start drawing those grid cells. The best practice is to set this particular environment to be equal to an existing data set that's in your current GIS project, one of your input data sets, a data set that you trust, and you want your outputs to match in cell alignment to that particular data set. Again, here's the help documentation for this particular property. You can see arcpy.env.snap raster. Here is the code for that. When you're setting it equal to be just a single parameter, and this is the raster to be used as the snap raster, and here's where you would put in the actual data set that you want to set as the snap raster. All right, so that wraps up our look at some of the most common environment settings within ArcGIS for our raster data and our raster tools.